Hello. I am part of an organization that's trying to help people who are currently, financially challenged and can't pay rent. They are looking to form unions and things like that. I'm more interested in helping these people transform their properties into cooperatives, hopefully, in a way that would be both beneficial to the landlords and to the tenants, hopefully long term. But one of the things that I've been interested in a while is just the history of landlords renting, things like that. So this article I thought was really interesting, at least the title, A History of Landlords, Rent in the Feudal Origins of a Non-Working Class. And I saw here that 11-minute read, so I could go ahead and read that for everybody, anybody who's interested in listening to it rather than reading it themselves, or sometimes people like to read along. I know it helps me. Anyway, let's go ahead and read through it. So a quick recap of this, in case you don't want to stay for the whole thing. A History of Landlords, Rent in the Feudal Origins of a Non-Working Class. It's exactly what it says it is. It talks about the history of landlords relating to back when the king owned all the land and charged lords or noblemen to take care of it, and a bunch of politics and stuff with the church. And it was a kind of a way to get around usury, charging people money just because you have money and making money. So instead, you could charge people money for living on your land, and instead of just letting them have their God-given right to have a place to live, like the birds and the bees and all that good stuff. He doesn't really say that or go into that, but I thought it was a really good article, kind of laid it all out. Maybe a little bit longer than I would have liked, but really kind of interesting in how this stuff got into English law and then basically colonized the world. I like this, how it's basically there's a average of how much it costs to actually maintain land, and then people have to pay more than that in order to give landlords some income so they can make money for just kind of managing things. And that managing things is big time. So out of $11,000, he makes the argument that you pay about $11,000 in order to get about $2,000 worth of actual labor and paying for taxes. So pretty wild. It makes a pretty good argument why landlords renting is not a great system, and goes into my favorite system alternative, the housing cooperative, and how that could work out, where instead people basically create their community and treat it like a mini government. And I also, at the end of this, talk about my idea of a property management company owned by the people and for the people, and maybe it'd be a good way to kind of help renters buy the places where they rent into housing cooperatives. Yeah, essentially maybe a property management / renters cooperative. I hope you enjoy. Thanks. Bye. Okay, A History of Landlords, Rent in the Feudal Origins of a Non-Working Class by John Loritz? Sorry, John. In 2015, studies estimate that U.S. renters paid $535 billion to landlords in residential rents. To put this in perspective, $535 billion is about enough to give $15,000 to every human being in the United States state of California. It would also be enough to replace every page of every book in the U.S. Library of Congress with $100 bills. And if a person stood outside of Walt Disney World every day from open to close, handing $30,000 in cash to each individual visitor, it would take a year to hand out $535 billion. But what exactly did this massive sum of money actually pay for? Why did people start paying landlords in the first place? And do lands really need lords? The historical origin of landlords, feudalism, and the medieval politics of land. Long before the blossoming of modern technology and the dawn of the industrial era, humanity occupied only a fraction of the lands it does today. Between the hubs of ancient commerce, an immense wilderness existed that, legally speaking, was the property of no one, and even land that had already been settled was likely to be managed communally. In parts of West Europe, wild and communal lands were and are still called commons, and those who could not or did not wish to make a living in the town often had the option to subsist by farming common land or to join a communal farming village that was already established. Similar forms of non-private, custom-based, and communal systems of land use existed across the globe in the pre-industrial ages for tens of thousands of years until a few centuries ago. Pre-capitalist society, the feudal mode of production. So we have a graph here, population in millions going way up. So starting from 1 AD to 2000. So it shows the human growth curve. Before modern notions of private property arose alongside the full development of capitalism in the 18th century, social and economic life in medieval Europe was organized within a system that today is known as feudalism. Under the pre-industrial conditions of feudalism, the central focus of economic activity was agriculture. And since land was the main thing needed for production, land holdings were the most important form of wealth in feudal society. In the same sense that money is power in capitalist societies today, land is power in feudal society. Landed lords and feudal hierarchy. Feudalism appears in different forms depending on time and place. In feudal England, all land belonged to a king who strategically granted titles to powerful members of the nobility that allowed them to rule over large estates in exchange for pledges to provide knights or soldiers for the king's military. In turn, the lords of these estates, none of whom could possibly use so much land, leased part of the land to their aristocratic peers and important allies, many of whom also sublet parts of their land, often for similar pledges of military aid, for rent, or as payment for services. So we got a picture with the church on the top. Under the church is the monarchy or the king. Under the monarchy or king, you get the feudals, the feudalists, the lords and the nobles. Under them are the knights and the vassals. Under them, the craftsmen, merchants, and farmers. And then under them, you have the peasants and the serfs. Probably the people doing the, farmers, and then under them. So yeah, interesting picture there. Noble landholders were considered to be the lords of their subtenants, as well as the peasants and serfs inhabiting the land. And most lords were also considered a tenant, also known as a vassal, or the overlord who granted the land to them. A lord whose land was given directly by the king was known as a tenant-in-chief and held the title of baron. In addition to attending the king's councils, altogether such arrangements added up to form a kind of military agrarian complex that reinforced the monarchic regime's ability to control land through a complex bureaucracy of landholders that enforced the rigid hierarchy of feudal society. The historical origins of rent. while the warlords, aristocrats, and church officials who made up the landholding class mostly occupied political, military, and religious roles, it was the peasants who did the work in feudal society. Unlike the nobility, few peasants had their own land, and many were considered serfs, an old French word related to servant and slave, who were legally prohibited from leaving the land they cultivated without their lord's permission. So you had to have your lord's permission to leave the land, due to laws dating from the late Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is still alive, folks. In most cases, serfs were bound to work the same land as their ancestors, which meant that serfs were essentially leased along with the land by one landed lord to another. So the slaves came with the land, while free peasants at least could move or be married without permission slips. Their circumstances were rarely better. Since most were landless, landed lords demanded rents from peasants in exchange for the right to work the soil, often paid with daily labor or with a hefty part of the peasant's own harvest. Because the church had forbidden usury, that is lending money at interest, so basically making loans, which is forbidden in, I think, in the Bible. I have to look up reference, but I'm pretty sure. Landed lords started to buy and sell leases of land. And by the year 1500, the leasehold had become a common and lucrative way to circumvent the church's ban. So rent is basically a tricky way to get around usury, but you're still making money because you have more money, which is essentially usury. The practice of transferring land in the form of leaseholds, which naturally included the feudal right to exploit the labor of serfs and extract rent from its tenants, is what forms the legal foundation for the residential leases that exist across the world today. The transition from feudal to capitalist rent. So here's a map showing the extent to which European legal systems, such as English common law and Roman civil law, spread across the globe due to European colonialism. So the blue is the civil law. That's blue. Or I think it's too small to even read. Anyway. Unlike the hereditary rights of kings to rule or the institutions of serfdom, which had already been largely eroded by the time of the Industrial Age, the feudal relationships of landlord and tenant were never really abolished. As factory-based industry spread, the market economics that would come to characterize the emerging capitalist societies took hold around the world, much of which, thanks to colonialism, had not just been colonized by Europe, but also by European legal systems. Along with the feudal property laws, they codified. The English system was transplanted everywhere from the Americas and Pacific Islands to Africa, India, and Australia, while similar feudal systems were exported by France, Spain, and other colonial and imperialist nations. Over the next few hundred years, feudal leaseholds, as well as the land in general, were gradually privatized through acquisitions, settlement, and processes of enclosure pushed by governments that were often led by the same wealthy lords in shiny new capitalist hats. Different clothes, same game. So the pink is colonized, controlled by European douchebags. Green is partially controlled by European douchebags. The gray is Europe. Strongly influenced by European douchebags. Yellow, never colonized by European douchebags. Is that Japan? These ones got colonized by Japan, though. So Japan never and Korea, and I can't make out which that one is, but there we go. Why do landlords still exist today, even setting aside the social and legal history that traces the origin of rent collection to feudal entitlements that granted hereditary rights to inbred clans of medieval warlords? There is still the question, why should landlords be entitled to payment at all? That's the big question, folks. Why should landlords be entitled to payment at all? Why is this system even legal? Why is it still around? A word about small versus large-scale landlords. Before continuing the discussion, an important distinction needs to be drawn between the small-time mom-and-pop landlord and the big-time tycoons and corporate landlords. The key point of difference is that small-time landlords tend to act as groundskeepers who perform labor, such as landscaping and maintenance, whereas the tycoon and corporate landlords act as shareholders, hiring others to perform the labor of maintaining their property. In the interest of fairness, the following discussion will consider small-time landlords to be groundskeepers and exclusively address the large-scale landlords. Interesting. Political economy of rental agreements. The rental of residential land and living space is a strange commodity. Broadly speaking, commodities, whether physical products like food and cars, services like repair and healthcare, or information like research and iPhone apps, are the result of some kind of production. Or in other words, commodities are made by people using other things. Cars are made by people using factory machinery. And steel, things are repaired by people using tools and parts, and apps are created by software developers with knowledge gained from education, and the value of each is determined by how much labor is needed to produce them. But who produces land and space? With what material? And how many labor hours on average is needed to produce them? If a thing is produced, it is reasonable to argue that the person who labored to make the thing has a right to control its use, whether she wants to use it herself, lend or sell it to others, or give it away because she created it. That, in fact, is exactly the reasoning used by, favorite of mine, reasoning used by classical liberal philosophers like John Locke to support the idea of a natural right to property, which is fairly radical at the time because it opposed the feudal entitlements to land held by a ruling minority of aristocrats. Things like land and space, along with springs, oyster beds, or other forms of natural capital, are non-produced. And if neither the landlord's nor anyone's labor is a factor of land existence, why should society's laws entitle landlords to payment from anyone too poor to buy property? Why should society's laws entitle landlords to payment from anyone too poor to buy property? How rent harms the economy and drains workers' wealth. The absurdity of entitlements to rent is clearest in cases of unimproved land with no structures, utilities, or other bells and whistles added. Extracting rent for the use of idle soil and empty living space is nothing but a legalized act of extortion, since the basis of society and human survival is available. Since the basis of society and human survival is availability of living space and cultivation of land to keep others from occupying living space or using land productively is not just violent but antisocial in the most literal sense of the word. In cases of improved land, rent collection seems more defensible at first. It may be argued, for instance, that a landlord who buys an apartment complex and pays for its upkeep has a right to collect rents to recover his investment and in reward for assuming the risk. But this accounts only for the landlord's personal interest without considering the deficit to society overall. After the cost to build the complex, the only real costs left are to maintain it. Since these costs must be less than a landlord's revenue to create income, rents must always exceed the real cost to maintain the property, and rent collectors must always be less efficient than if tenants had simply paid such costs directly. So we got a diagram how rent transfers wealth from the working class to the non-working class. So the real cost to maintain housing is the dotted line in the middle. And then you see on the negative on the left from the workers' wages, so the actual cost of maintaining housing, and then they got to pay more than that, and that money goes to the landlords, which gives them more. So, yeah. The real cost to build and maintain housing is unavoidable because society depends on housing to exist. And while small-time landlords often provide at least some real labor and materials, rent collection in itself contributes nothing to this endeavor. If small-time landlords who maintain properties are considered as workers, like the groundskeepers, and other workers who are paid for similar labor, the remaining landlords' only labor is to manage the rent collecting business. This is booming, folks, because everyone needs a place to live. The balance sheet of the non-working class. According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, aka HUD, this rental business raked in $11,232 per unit yearly for about 43.9 million housing units in 2015. And I'm sure those numbers have gone up. But what does the business provide in return? The U.S. Census Bureau's Rental Housing Finance Survey shows landlords spend an average of 10 hours per month managing properties overall, while half of them spend just 3 hours per month or less, and that is according to landlords' own responses. The average expenses were $4,751 per unit, and most of it covered property tax and business activity, insurance, payroll, professional and legal services, etc., while maintenance, grounds, and landscaping accounted for just $1,906. This means that aside from the necessary cost to continue providing housing to a renter, the landlord collects, so $11,000 minus the almost $2,000 equals somewhere around $9,000. Around $9,326. After settling property taxes, coincidentally, also $1,906 per unit on average, the landlord is essentially siphoning $7,420 from the wages of each of their tenants for $11,232. A U.S. tenant can expect $1,900 in maintenance and landscaping services on average. So for only $11,000, we'll give you about $2,000 worth of labor, in addition to not having to pay the property tax, and that's it. In return for arranging those services, the average landlord can expect to be free from the kinds of wage labor that most renters have no choice but to perform if they wish to enjoy the privilege of a roof over their head. Hold on. The average landlord can expect to be free from the kinds of wage labor that most renters have no choice but to perform. So Basically, landlords don't have to do much work, is what they're saying, wage labor, that most renters have no choice but to do wage labor to perform if they wish to enjoy the privilege of a roof over their head. Envisioning alternative systems of land tenure. Oh, this should be interesting. The alternatives to this medieval system of land tenure are only limited by the imagination. One of the more straightforward options would be to transform private residential properties into, this author gets a thumbs up from me, housing cooperatives grouped by neighborhood, building, or community. Yep, love it. Instead of rent, funds for maintenance costs, national average about $2,000, would be pooled together through the cooperatives and paid out as needed, and surplus could be redistributed as dividends to residents to incentivize efficient repairs or reinvested in improvements, community gardens, pools, shared tool libraries, cooperative Wi-Fi zones, etc. Staff. So here's a diagram of what a housing cooperative may or may not look like. So you have your co-op members there on the left in green. They live in the housing co-op, kind of like a condo association. They elect a board of directors if that's how they want to do it, and they can guide policy and budget. Or they could use Lumio and not need a board of directors and vote directly. Staff, over on the right, they're hired by the board, day-to-day management of the co-op. So you pay people to kind of manage things, and if you don't like the way they do it, they're fired. And they move on. Board of directors are elected by co-op members, they're at the bottom on red, and governs the co-op affairs. So they're kind of overlooking. So you're paying people to kind of overlook and make the decisions, which is good, right? Like, I know there's a lot of things that I don't make good decisions on that I would be more welcome for anybody else to do it. But I'd like to be able to see what they're doing, so I make sure that they're in line with my values. Depending on how the transition to cooperative housing was handled, it might even be plausible to preserve the jobs of small-time landlords as groundskeepers who are compensated for labor rather than property ownership. Yes. The process of changing residents would remain mostly the same, except that cooperatives would manage applications rather than landlords, and the major consideration would be the average maintenance costs at different housing cooperatives rather than rental agreements. Yeah, and basically the small-time landlord, you can just owe him the loan payments, mortgage payments, instead of rent. So he can still get paid that way. So toward universal housing and a world without rent, of course the real problem lies in overcoming political obstacles to land reform. Though rental property owners make up just 3% of the U.S. population, what? Really? 3% of the U.S. population. The rental housing market is stuffed with nearly as much capital as the U.S. defense budget. And so it may be fair to say that a successful U.S. land reform movement would be about as hard to build as a successful U.S. anti-war movement. Not impossible, of course, but pretty damn challenging. The good news is that virtually everyone in society stands to benefit from ditching this outdated model. And if the historical record is any indication, the chance of revolutionary action is likely to rise pretty quickly once enough of the peasants are miffed about unfair land distributions. And if history teaches us anything, it is that nothing, not kings, nor even gods, can hold the united wrath of the peasants in abeyance for long. In solidarity, John Loritz. Wow, well done, John. I like this article. If you like these posts, please consider buying this writer a cup of coffee using the PayPal account. Please do. Go buy him some coffee. We're making a monthly donation using Patreon. It's like a voluntary subscription directly to an artist and journalist. No cryptocurrency, no Bitcoin, no way to pay that way. And here's the references, some notes. Oh, here's two for feudalism, I think. There is ongoing, in my opinion, very necessary academic debate over whether the term feudalism is useful, partly due to overuse of the term in describing a broad category of things, and partly due to white academics' shitty tendency to smush the colorful spectrum of global history and culture into a bland two-tone scheme of Europe and seems like this one thing in Europe. In this post, I've chosen to use feudalism in a strict Marxian sense to refer to a range of pre-capitalist, non-industrial societies characterized by 1, land being the main form of wealth, and 2, the productive classes' ability to subsist on the direct fruits of their labor. More about the author there. It's not an award-winning journalist. Follow to join the comic futility of his quest to defeat capitalism with art and math. So anyway, I liked that article. The one thing that I want to add that might be a really powerful tool in this, can I make myself bigger? I can. An idea that I have is a property management cooperative. So basically a property management company that is owned and run by the people. Essentially, if you think property management, and I would roll it up into kind of like an insurance scheme. So if you can figure out how to sell people insurance, and so it'd be renter's insurance, and all the renters would get into this insurance, and not only would it supply insurance for, somebody steals your laptop while you're in your house. Happened to me. Didn't have renter's insurance. Wish I did. Anything that goes wrong, there's, renter's insurance is great. But the one thing it doesn't do is that I know of, if your landlord isn't treating you fair, right? Well, how about insurance for that? Help me with my crappy landlord. Or in this situation, right? Like, my landlord can't evict me. What am I going to do? But I can't pay rent because I can't work because the economy's shut down, pretty much. So that's the way I think could kind of get underneath everything. And then with that kind of an insurance company, and it also maybe provide moving assistance, right? Like, you got to move to a new place. It would help you find a new place. It would follow you around. And then hopefully start buying up rental properties and trying to get everybody to move into those. And those rental properties would be not rental properties, but cooperatives. They'd turn into cooperatives, and they would pay for the mortgage payment. And then that way you start slowly aggregating equity in all these properties owned by the umbrella property management company. But you try your best to make the power rise up from the individuals and give power to people, because guess what? We have technology, and we can all get our power back because America was founded on the sovereignty of the people, right? Sovereignty of the people. That, as John Quincy Adams said, that the United States may have been the first legitimate government ever, or at least a big one, where the people voted and said, yeah, we kind of want to live like this, and these are the rules that we want to live. Because guess what? Nobody can really come up with a really good reason why somebody can tell somebody else what to do, as long as those people aren't telling other people what to do. Anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts. This is really important to me. Huge, big important to me, especially during this time. Stay healthy, stay safe, and fill your hearts full of love. Bye.